Okay, hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is round 3 of Book Sandwiched in 2023. Thanks to everybody who's here. We love to see these numbers, and the people on Zoom. We're happy that we can use both formats. I want to also, as usual, thank my selection committee, Margot Brown, Lisa Derrickson, Dusty Hewitt, Gary McCaslin, and Pam Sonnenfeld, and also Card Carrying Books and Gifts, who were a great support to Book Sandwiched In this year. They gave a copy to each presenter of the particular book they were reviewing, and also paid for the bookmarks that we used to promote the program. Today's book is Beautiful Country, a memoir by Qian Julie Wang. If you haven't read it, there are 8 copies in the library system, so you can take it out. No audio or ebook this time, though. I was interested to see. Pam Walker is with us today to present Beautiful Country. Many of you have seen Pam's presentations in the past. I think she did one just last year. Did you do the Murder Club?
I did.
Yeah, she did the Thursday Murder Club last year. Pam's lived in Corning for over 30 years, raising 2 sons with her husband, Bob. She began her career working as a city planner and finished as a 6th grade English language arts teacher at the Alternative School for Math and Science here in Corning. Her curriculum at ASMS included many middle grade and young adult works of fiction about the immigrant experience, which piqued her interest in Beautiful Country. She retired in 2020, which allows her more time to enjoy hiking, bicycling, and fly fishing. She also helps out in the children's department at the library and serves on the planning commission for the city of Corning. Thanks, Pam, for coming.
Thank you, Louise. I appreciate it. And I'll just say this is a different experience than reviewing the Thursday Murder Club. I think there were 2 people in the room with me, and it was all on Zoom. And now I'm speaking, I'm Zooming. If you see somebody asking to be admitted, like maybe give me a high sign, because there's a lot going on up here for me. So anyway, to get underway. If you've been attuned at all to the news, you've seen and heard stories about undocumented immigrants and our border crisis. The images really challenge our humanity. Children are separated from families. Migrants perish in overheated trucks. Refugees are bussed across the country and deposited at the vice president's residence, pawns in a political game. It would be easy to conclude that the immigration crisis is due, whoops, let me make this work. Uh-oh. There we go. It would be easy to conclude that the immigration crisis is due to Central and South American migrants overrunning our southern border and stealing Americans' jobs. Oh, we're still going. So let me back up. Yeah.
Could you speak a little louder, please, Pam?
Or maybe
let's, okay. Yeah. How's this? Is the mic picking me up at all? Is the mic picking me up now? Not so much. I'm going to use my teacher voice. How's that? Okay. All right. Beautiful Country by Qian Julie Wang shows us otherwise. It's a memoir of the undocumented childhood of a Chinese migrant, and it presents what for me was an unexpected and painful perspective on the trauma of living in the shadows of our so-called beautiful country. Before I go any further, though, I need to acknowledge that the experiences Qian Julie Wang shares in Beautiful Country are very far from my own personal experience. I was born in the United States with definite advantages. Who am I to comment on her story? Well, as Louise indicated, in part, I accepted the invitation to speak today because I was an English teacher who did a unit on immigrant narratives. As an English teacher, I taught what I tried to include in my teaching were stories that were maybe not so often acknowledged and overlooked, like the exclusion of Chinese immigrants, the sweatshops in the Lower East Side, and the detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. and also our country's uneven treatment of political refugees. I hope that reading Wang's story would extend my own understanding of the United States' complex relationship with its immigrants. Also, on a personal level, I was intrigued by Beautiful Country because my own family history begins with an undocumented immigrant's journey. The younger woman in this photograph is my Korean great-grandmother who slipped into San Francisco in 1895, gave birth to my grandmother, grandfather, who she had to leave behind. I guess today you'd call him an anchor baby. And when she left, she was repatriated to Japanese occupied Korea under the exclusion laws in the United States at the time. So my family too, over the years, has experienced its share of prejudice. So then what's my take on Beautiful Country? Well, above all, I find it an emotionally powerful story, and I hope I can convey that effectively today. Also, Wang's voice as a writer is really unique in my reading of immigrant narratives. So I'm going to try to summarize her story without giving too much away. Then I'll talk about some of the themes of the book. And then finally, I'd like to share some of my personal takeaways from Beautiful Country. I'm a map person, so I have to start with a map. Qian Wang's journey begins when she's just a toddler in Handan, China. She's adored by her grandparents and her large extended family. She's a popular and pampered child. Her mother was a professor of computer science and mathematics and sews fancy dresses for Qian. Her friends look to her as a leader, and her father absolutely dotes on her. Qian describes her father, who she calls Baba, as popular and fun-loving. At the same time, he's clearly traumatized by the Cultural Revolution. He witnessed his brother's execution and endured shame with his family for that brother's outspokenness against the regime. And Baba's resentment against government control and censorship finally pushed him to leave the country. He was the first in Wang's family to travel to America, or Meiguo, which translates to Beautiful Country. Qian and her mother decide to join him, and this event changes their lives. Wang writes, "I ascended into adulthood at cruising altitude." This, by the way, was at the age of 7. So when she and her mother touch down at JFK, she becomes an undocumented immigrant, a member of a hidden society that lives in the shadows of New York City. Wang and her family settle into a succession of homes and jobs that demonstrate the sad irony of the book's title. America for them is anything but beautiful. Their first home is a single room in a Brooklyn house that shelters several families, mostly Spanish speaking, all sharing a single kitchen and single bathroom. It also shelters, as anyone who's lived in New York City can guess, an impressive number of cockroaches. One of the first meals she remembers is a single slice of pizza, which she thought was absolutely delicious, but which made up the evening meal for her entire family that day. Hunger for her is a constant companion until it's replaced by a glut of greasy, salty calories, the only food her family can afford. So without legal standing, Qian's parents are forced to accept the most menial of jobs brokered through a network of employment agents who place undocumented immigrants in off-the-books sweatshops. Wang describes them from the perspective of the young child she was at the time. Her mother's first job is attaching labels to garments, for which she's paid 3 cents a piece, and she labors 12 hours a day at this with a half-hour break. 7-year-old Qian works by her side, earning a penny apiece for snipping loose threads. In this setting, a hierarchy emerges to her young child's mind. The most skilled and best paid workers sew on buttons. They eat better food. They live in more spacious apartments. The least skilled, Qian and her mother among them, barely scrape by. And then what follows is a series of progressively more demeaning jobs. In a fish processing plant for sushi, Qian and her mother work long hours with their limbs painfully submerged in icy water. Then as a hairdresser, Qian's mother is subjected to both low pay and the wandering hands of male clients. One of these men befriends Qian and her mother, taking them on weekly trips to McDonald's until a more savvy Asian female friend explains that his intentions are actually quite creepy. Qian lives through all of this before she even reaches the age of 10. In her telling, even other immigrants, possibly undocumented themselves, contribute to her family's daily struggle. The Chinese American landlady turns off the heat on the coldest days when she decides it becomes too expensive. Their Spanish-speaking housemates hurl racial slurs at Qian's family. Cantonese-speaking Chinese immigrants treat Qian and her Mandarin-speaking family with disdain at work and at school. But maybe the most damaging element of Qian's experience emotionally is her pervasive sense of anxiety and trauma. When they first arrive in the United States, Wang's parents caution her that she has to avoid policemen and any authorities who might discover their undocumented status, and that she always has to tell people that she was born in America. That instills in her a permanent, almost debilitating dread of being discovered and deported by people in uniform. That fear prevents her from accepting food from what might have been a Salvation Army outreach program, even though she was starving at the time. Fear was all I tasted, she recalls. It also stops her from complaining about a serious injury in a playground accident, leaving her to nurse the pain of a broken hand on her own. The fact that Qian's parents themselves feel this fear so deeply impedes them from protecting her from suffering. It also isolates Qian. Here's how Wang explains it. Hunger was a constant, reliable friend in Meiguo. In China, all I needed to do was say that she was there and Mama would find food for me. In Meiguo, I quickly learned that I could not voice her presence. It only hurt Mama. Her face reflected the pangs in my stomach, and the few times when I ventured to ask for food, Mama did something she had never done before. She told me that hunger was good, that it was fine to feel shaky and distracted, and that I should see if I could hold on until the cold sweat came, because that would mean I was really growing and really getting stronger. So that kind of affirmation and insistence on quietly enduring misery pervades Qian's story. Qian's childhood memories are filled with reminders to keep your head down, stick to the shadows, avoid standing out, tolerate your victimhood, stifle your complaints. As her parents were overtaken by these shadows, Wang writes, I learned quickly that people were dangerous, but I also learned that there were certain expressions of anger and coldness that I could wear to keep people a little farther away. I started to put on a mask of those expressions every time I left home. Again, this is the story of a girl under the age of 10. So when I read about Qian's childhood, I find it remarkable that she had the strength to overcome these experiences. But even though I thought Qian's story was very dark, she does describe some glimmers of hope. When she starts school in first grade, Qian is placed in a special ed classroom due to her lack of English, where the teacher completely ignores her. But this allows her the freedom to explore English language books on her own. She says, I spent my school days in the company of the Cat in the Hat, the Very Hungry Caterpillar, the Berenstain Bears, Amelia Bedelia, and Shel Silverstein. Every day I learned a few new words. I read until my loneliness dulled and I felt myself to be in the good company of all my vibrantly colored two-dimensional friends. I read until excitement replaced hopelessness. Libraries offered Qian the same kind of respite. She writes of borrowing stacks of Babysitter's Club books along with other classics. And as her reading advances, so does her facility with words, to the point that a very inept fifth grade teacher tells her she couldn't possibly have written the assignments she turns in. The same teacher admonishes her to wear nicer clothes and to change them more often, which were beyond her family's ability to do for her. Fortunately, some of Qian's teachers had more empathy, like the third grade teacher who gifted her a copy of Charlotte's Web. But this is not a feel-good story of an immigrant family uplifted by the power of education and personal effort. Wang doesn't let us off the hook that easily. The turning point for Qian's family comes when a personal tragedy forces them to face their fears of being deported, to summon the authorities for help. I'm going to not spoil that drama by sharing the cascading series of crises that befall the family. At least you know that in the end, Wang succeeds in becoming a published author. The book jacket biography tells us a little more too. She graduated from Swarthmore and Yale Law, and she's the managing partner in her own civil rights law firm. I will say, though, that the ending of this book asks readers to re-examine what it means for us to be a nation of immigrants. There's a lot to think about in Beautiful Country, and so I'd like to highlight some of the themes that resonated for me as I read this book. Perhaps what stands out most is the fact that this is a story told in the first-person voice of a young child, which is unique in my experience of the genre, but Qian's memories seem to belong to a much older person. Hers is a story of how adversity can force children to grow up very quickly. Qian, like immigrants of the more distant past, shared responsibility for helping her family survive, which meant she worked in sweatshops and spent much of her time without adult supervision or protection, something I hadn't really considered a privilege in today's world. Instead, Qian saw herself as the one who guided her mother through minefields of an inhospitable America. Wang writes, "I learned that there were some things that Mama didn't know how to do, but that I did. Over time, she came to see too. As I stopped asking her questions, she started asking more of me." One of the things Qian's parents asked of her was to make her way home from school each day on the subway, which exposed her more than once to the dangers and indignities of exhibitionists and other nefarious older men, none of whom she could report out of fear of the authorities. Qian's American childhood of the 1990s actually has a lot in common with an 1800s Milltown childhood, endless hours of abysmally compensated labor and horrendous living conditions. Those of us who thought sweatshops were a thing of the past, who thought everyone could teach their children that the authorities were the people they could turn to for help, or who enjoyed the luxury of a protective approach to parenting, can see that these are assumptions we can make only because of our prosperity and our security. If we're shocked by Qian's experiences, though, we need to consider that much of her suffering comes from just poverty, another recurring theme in Beautiful Country. The Wang family's substandard housing and inadequate heat are circumstances shared by poor people everywhere. We should think about this as a community when we oppose workforce housing and question the impacts of those people living among us. So is relying on meals made up of cheap, salty, fatty calories and too little nutrition. Qian emphasizes this often when describing her family's meals. Of course, she had access to free breakfast and lunch through school, which was a huge relief to her cash-strapped family. But this also has its downsides. Students getting free lunches were embarrassed to have their poverty revealed to others as they waited to turn in their meal coupons, while their more affluent classmates got to eat and go out to recess. Wang writes that she often had too little time to eat before lunch was over. She recalls this humiliation occurring over and over at school, and another instance when she bought a secret Santa gift for a required class activity with her hard-earned pennies, only to have it mocked as cheap and ugly. Qian even learned that trash in America is segregated by income when her family scavenges for good trash from other neighborhoods to furnish their apartment. And of course, she feels exposed to ridicule when a classmate catches her in these shopping trips. Another theme in Beautiful Country is the form of racism directed toward ethnic Asians in America, which is being perceived as perpetually the outsider, different and foreign. Qian's family warns her about this. When she starts school, she remembers Baba's admonishment, "Just remember this, Qian, we are only safe with our own kind." She writes, "None of the other races were our friends. To all of them, we were weak, easy targets who wouldn't fight back." This stereotype of the weak Asian is coupled with the corollary of the exotic, hypersexualized female. Qian's mother is a victim of this, literally at the hands of the white male clients she works for at her hair salon. But one of the most horrifying incidents Qian recounts is being victimized by a white man whose dog charges through a closed gate and attacks Qian and her mother, biting them. We could tell that the man had seen what happened, Wang writes, but he said nothing and wore a smirk on his face. So historian Ronald Takaki discusses this assumption of foreignness in his book, A Different Mirror. Although Takaki was born and raised in Hawaii and saw himself as an all-American surfer dude more than anything else, his college classmates asked him frequently how long he'd been in the country and where he learned to speak English. My own grandfather's college yearbook enthuses that he has mastered the English language, customs, and ideals no less thoroughly than one of us, in spite of my grandfather's being born and bred in San Francisco. I myself can remember jeering voices of complete strangers who would pass our house yelling out, "Why do you live with a Chinese man?" And I'm also reminded of an American-born, ethnically Asian student of mine who was assigned to an ESL program at his elementary school, even though he spoke and wrote perfect English. So it's no surprise then, the most powerful theme that emerges from Beautiful Country is the question, where is home? Wang titles a 0 chapter of her book Home and describes the fearless sense of warmth, safety, and love she felt in her earliest memories of China. That's a stark contrast to the danger lurking for her in America, where she rarely seems to feel secure. She admits this. In the vacuum of anxiety that was undocumented life, fear expanded to fill our entire world until it was all we could breathe. Sometimes Wang expresses this with a dark humor. She says, China was home and America smelled like pee. Ultimately, it seems the only place Qian feels really at home is between the covers of a good book. One of her earliest reading memories, she writes about, for the first time since leaving Zhangguo, or China, I was home. I was just another American kid. I was a normal girl, cradled by a supportive family and a stable circle of friends. So how should we react to Beautiful Country? What can we take away from reading her story? Well, first, I think it's really important to read critically. After all, I was an English teacher. We need to remember that this is a memoir and that memoirs differ from autobiographies. Yes, a memoir is a form of nonfiction, but it's a truth that's told through a prism that might distort or slant a story. Wang herself admits memory is a fickle thing, but I've endeavored to document my family's undocumented years as authentically and intimately as possible. Even so, she later writes, I can no longer tell whether the images come to me from my firsthand experiences or whether they've since been diluted by scenes filtered from movies and documentaries. We readers would be wise to remember that the emotional truth of a memoir may be more accurate than the details of day-to-day life. But that emotional truth is a gut punch in Beautiful Country, a gut punch about childhood in America. As someone who's worked with children, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the mental health consequences of psychological traumas and wounds like Qian's can impact behavior, development, academic performance. Wang admits it would take therapy's slow and arduous unraveling for me to see that the thread of trauma was woven into every fiber of my family, my childhood. Fortunately, she made that journey and is capable of articulating the impact of her early experiences. Finally, Beautiful Country for me emphasizes the importance of resisting the temptation to lump all immigrant experiences together, as we often do when we construct our country's story. That immigration unit that I taught in middle school, almost every resource that's available to students of a middle school age for research could be summed up with this conclusion. Life was tough for immigrants, but they tried hard, got an education, and never gave up hope. Eventually, they succeeded in becoming real Americans after a few generations. So we tend to mythologize the immigrant experience, and obviously that's problematic. It glosses over the power of prejudice and indignity And it fails to fully acknowledge the significant work we need to do as a country to expunge structural racism and victim blaming in our culture. Patty Davis, the daughter of our former President Reagan, wrote recently in the New York Times, "There isn't just one truth, our truth. The other people who inhabit our story have their truths as well." Beautiful Country forces us to look at those other truths in our history and in our present. If you'd like to look at some of those other truths, I recommend Enrique's Journey by Sonia Nazario, which is a journalist's account of a young Honduran boy's journey. Another important voice I've read recently is Carla Cornejo Villavicencio's in The Undocumented Americans, where she talks about her own story as a DACA recipient, along with reporting on other undocumented Spanish-speaking communities. But in conclusion, I think Beautiful Country shows us how easy it can be to dismiss the humanity of the less fortunate among us. It reminds us that if we want to live up to our nation's promise as a place of refuge, we have to guard against blaming, objectifying, and dehumanizing vulnerable people who need and deserve support, respect, and empathy. So, thank you. Thank you for that too. And it's our format that we have time for questions, and I'm happy to stay and discuss whatever anybody would like to know about. Yes.
Can you put a year on this?
It's from the 1990s.
Wow.
Yes, Gary.
Pam, we have child labor laws in this country. How did did she give any indication about how these people were able to have these factories where people are?
Well, she doesn't talk about it, but there are so many instances of labor laws that people don't have the benefit of having applied to them if they're undocumented. You become open to all kinds of abuse when you can't complain.
But I mean, if somebody, I mean, it had to be a building of some kind of size that these people, that they could, what say, they can still fly.
Right.
Well, you really depressed me here.
It's not a happy story. But again, I think it's really, I guess when I read it, one of my overwhelming reactions was, wow, this sounds like stuff that's come out of some discussions with a psychoanalyst, or and the author does talk about her years of therapy. Easy to overlook some of the good things that happened, but they were there. They just don't rise to the same level of prominence as the trauma does.
Just one more follow-up. Is there any indication from her memoir how the family was able to progress the way they did?
Yes.
I mean,
It's a surprise ending, I can't tell you. but it's completely different from what you might expect. Now you have to read it. Okay. Yes.
The term undocumented immigrant, does that mean that they bypass everything legal, or is it that they come in with stipulations that they have to comply?
So it's implied, but because of the first person child's voice, it's not absolutely clear. It's implied that she and her mother had visas, perhaps tourist visas, and that they overstayed their visas. Yes, sir.
We come from one group of how this applied. She's got all this stuff put on her, a lot of it was fertilized. What her, she's got to be learning different rules of life within that socioeconomic group. Did any of that come up? The different rules of survival?
Sure. I think, the idea that you just tolerate your hunger, that, when you're on the subway, don't make eye contact, look down, the things those men are showing you, don't tell anybody about those. I think for me, one of the saddest things about Chen's story is that she can't really even tell her parents about all the horrible things that are happening to her because they're having their own traumas at work and their marriage slowly falls apart and her family, goes through just a lot of horrible things.
But when I'm thinking of the feeling of the bread, you
Mhm.
that type of thing, because you need the food, not just actions you have to take.
Yeah, so she doesn't describe anything illegal that her family did other than just the fact of their existence in the country being something that had to be hidden. But well, I will say that, I mentioned that she didn't, she nursed a broken hand. Her family is terrified of going to the doctor or going to the hospital because that might expose them. They go to underground Chinese doctors instead in the city. And it's questionable what kind of background these people had. There's just so many opportunities to be victimized by other people who are unscrupulous and who might take your money because you're desperate for something that they have to offer.
She was also really fearless in the way she described her interpersonal relationships with her friends at school. And sometimes she said she could be really cold with the heat and punch down at other kids. And I think that was probably a reaction to her always sheltering.
Sure. That kind of acting out, misbehaviors, what we might perceive as misbehaviors on a child's part are really defensive behaviors. Yeah.
So I listened to it and before I downloaded it from Audible, I glanced at the reader reviews, right? And not surprisingly, there were here and here, the people who thought it was a terrific book and a story that needed to be told, and the others who thought she was just whiny and angry and they didn't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And it sort of speaks to where we are as a country on this.
Yes.
I'm curious about how she got to school. They were so afraid of all of it, but they enrolled her in school.
They did. So they enroll her in a school that's distant. It's not within the district that her residents would send her to. And I think that had something to do with not wanting to be discovered. They give a false address. But then they also receive a lot of assurances that the school personnel don't check immigration status. And that happens over and over again. And they need it to happen over and over again. Yeah.
Well, and they could take her to a legit clinic for certain inoculations
Mhm.
that because
Because of school.
afforded in order for her to go to school, and that was always a really fraught thing.
Yes.
Did she ever go into the process of finally becoming naturalized?
She is an American citizen. She got her citizenship, I think, in 2016, she says. Yeah. Yep, Marshall.
She wrote a really wonderful essay in the New York Times, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, before the book came out. I was looking forward to starting to read the book. But, it was about being on the subway and how that was a great learning experience about how to fit in and how to learn English, how to learn her way to navigate the world. And you can find it, Google her name, New York Times, but it's a wonderful article.
Oh, and she also wrote a lot of this on the subway on the telephone.
One of the things really stands out for me, and I didn't include it because I was worried about time. Public resources did so much for her. Having access to public education, to public libraries, which are a refuge. And she even says to public transportation, which allowed her to move freely around the city from a very young age and get from one place to another and see a lot of different things. Those were critical. We have to remember that when our library votes come up. Yes.
So we talk about library. I don't think it's true in our, yes, in New York City, they are social workers that are stationed at the library.
I don't know.
Not
I
what
don't know.
do.
I was also struck by impactful words of kindness and encouragement were from, teachers, and conversely how impactful those
Those hurts were, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I've been told that, for every negative comment, it takes something like 8 to 10 positive comments to balance. We tend to hear the negative so much.
But like three in general.
Was there another question, comment back here?
Think of the immigrant situation in our country now. I mean, how it's being handled.
It's a mess. It's just a mess.
But you
Yeah.
have the kids,
Right, right.
they're not getting stealing.
So, my mother used to teach elementary school in Phoenix, in a South Phoenix neighborhood that was populated primarily by Mexican American immigrants and families, citizens. She told me a story one time. I think Arizona has at various times had incredibly harsh laws about services to people without documentation. And she told me one time about the sibling, an infant sibling of one of her students who was refused hospital treatment for, in a life-threatening situation because the family couldn't provide documentation that they were legitimate citizens of the United States. Just the inhumanity of it is just mind-boggling.
Just to follow up on Lisa's question, she doesn't make any comments about the political situation today. It's great.
She doesn't. This is her story of her elementary years, a little bit of her middle school years. And so it's, the rest is, there's a big black box between that and, college and later success. Although even one of her college professors kind of laughs at her dreams, like, you be a lawyer? No way. What makes you think you can do that?
So you have to be a sequel.
I think I don't know if I'm the person to ask about that. Yeah.
There's nothing implied.
No, there isn't. There isn't. Great. Thank you very